Hi, thanks for joining me today as we talk about condominium living. I want to begin with a true story. I knew of a person who purchased a condominium. She worked hard, she saved diligently, and she finally found what she thought was her dream home. Her unit was lovely. The building appeared to be well maintained, and the location was ideal for her. But shortly after she moved in, her neighbor sold their unit to a heavy smoker. Almost immediately, smoke began seeping into her apartment. When she turned to the condominium board and management for help, she was told that nothing could be done. You see, the governing documents for that condominium did not prohibit smoking, and therefore the board had no power to intervene. She was told that the living arrangement wasn't like that in an apartment building where the landlord could evict a tenant, but in this case, the board was powerless. She was told she'd have to hire her own attorney. But that was just the beginning. After a year or two, she was hit with a large special assessment. Thousands of dollars were needed for emergency repairs to the plumbing and elevators, and the condominium didn't have the cash on hand for the repairs. So everyone was imposed with a special assessment to cover the deficit. She had not been warned of these costs when she purchased her property, and in fact, she later learned that the previous owner probably sold the unit to avoid paying that very assessment. When she couldn't afford the bill, the association placed a lien on her property. They then added attorney fees to the lien. Her bank and the condo management threatened foreclosure if she didn't pay. In the end, she was forced to sell her home. Now, her story isn't unique. Far too often, people purchase condominiums without fully understanding what they're buying. They don't know what documents to review, what questions to ask, or what warning signs to watch for. And unfortunately, some of them end up regretting their purchase. But I want to emphasize right away, it doesn't have to be this way. Condominiums can be wonderful places to live. I know this from personal experience. I've lived in one for decades. I've also served on condominium boards, and I understand the personal interactions that may affect a board that sometimes cause ridiculous rules or arbitrary enforcement of rules. I've negotiated condominium contracts, and I understand how difficult it is for a condominium to negotiate a contract. I also understand what services they must contract for. I've studied condominium budgets. I understand how difficult it is to pass a budget and remain in office as a board member. In my case, after serving on the board the first time around, I vetoed a redecorating project idea, as I instead wanted the money to be spent in upgrading the boiler, the fire alarm system, and the plumbing. Well, I was voted out. Well, then after that, the place deteriorated a little bit and I was reelected. But then the second time around, when I proposed an affordable increase in fees to cover necessary repairs, I was voted out again. And to this day, the condo is still paying off that redecorating loan. But having said that, there are some wonderful condominiums and HOAs out there. I'm a certified board leader through the Community Association Institute, and as such, I've been able to network with over 50,000 other HOA members throughout the country, and I can see firsthand there are some who do a really excellent job maintaining their communities. On the other hand, I'm also an accountant and an attorney, and I've helped clients litigate against HOAs who ignored the law or their governing documents. On the other hand, I've also helped other clients locate an excellent HOA to live in. You see, the key is knowledge. If you understand how condominiums are structured, how they're governed, and how to evaluate their financial and legal health, you can avoid the horror stories and instead enjoy the many benefits of this lifestyle. And that's what today's lecture is about. In this presentation, I'll walk you through the essentials of condominium ownership. By the end, you'll know at least three things. First, you'll know what a condominium is and how it differs from other forms of housing. Second, you'll know the advantages of condominium living and the common pitfalls to watch out for. 3, You'll learn about the governing documents and the state laws that control a condo owner's rights and responsibilities. 4, you'll learn about the importance of the 3407 package and what information it contains. And finally, you'll learn the due diligence steps that every buyer should take before signing on the dotted line. So let's start with the basics. What is a condominium? A condominium is different from what's called a planned community, or also different from a cooperative. Although about 90% of what I teach you today also applies to planned communities or any other HOA, there are differences. Condominiums are governed by one subchapter of Title 68 of the Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes. Planned communities and cooperatives are governed by different subchapters with different rules. The heart of today's presentation, though, will be an explanation in layman's terms of the contents of the 3407 package. This is a package of information that each prospective condominium owner receives before the purchase, and it contains the information necessary to make an informed decision. However, there's a section 5407 which applies to planned communities, and it's really word for word the same as the 3407. I'm also going to go over my due diligence checklist of things to inspect before purchasing, and that due diligence checklist applies to condominiums and HOAs alike. So let's go back to condominiums. A condominium is a form of property ownership. When you buy a condominium, you're not just buying 4 walls and a ceiling. You're entering into a shared ownership arrangement with every other resident in the community. You're sharing ownership and management with dozens or hundreds of other owners, each of whom may have a different opinion about how the business should be run. Therefore, you should spend as much time examining the personalities of your neighbors as you do examining the living unit. Okay, let's digress for a minute and discuss some of the terms for condominium ownership and management. We're going to need to know these terms to understand the presentation. First, the owner of property in a condominium is referred to as the unit owner. That is, you own one unit in the condominium. The voting rights that you have, however, are not measured by the number of units that you own. Typically, a unit owner's voting rights are determined by the square footage of their property over the square footage of all property that's owned by all unit owners. So, if you own 2,000 square feet of space in a condominium that has 4 units at 2,000 square feet each, then your ownership interest is 2,000 square feet over the 8,000 square feet total, or 1/4 or 25%. Now, when you have a large condominium complex, then some people may have a 1-bedroom unit, others may have a 2-bedroom unit, and others a 3-bedroom or a larger unit. The square footage will differ in each of those units. Also, there might be some architectural features, such as a supporting column, that make some 2-bedroom units a few feet smaller or larger than other 2-bedroom units. The governing documents to your condominium indicate the voting rights of each of the individual units. And that means that unit owners who own the largest living spaces have more say in what happens in that condominium than the other unit owners. In fact, during board elections, usually the candidates will first court the constituents who own the largest units because they have the largest voting rights. And that sometimes leads to some pretty interesting personal dynamics. Okay, the next term that we're going to learn is about the declarant. The group or person or business that starts the condominium is called the declarant. This is usually the developer. The developer drafts the declaration, which serves as sort of like the constitution of the premises. The declaration is filed in the county where the condominium is located, filed in the county courthouse in the Recorder of Deeds office. After the last unit in the condominium is sold, the declarant may be out of the scene forever after that. Now, the other term we're going to learn is the executive board. The executive board is the group of folks who are voted in by unit owners to run the condominium. They are elected officials. They can be recalled, but typically only by a vote of more than 2/3 of all the unit owners. Usually they cannot be recalled by other members of the executive board. Oh, I mention that because sometimes you have one board member who's a maverick, who wants to improve things dramatically, and the other board members are used to the status quo and they try to expel that one board member. Well, they can't do that. It usually takes a vote of unit owners to expel a board member. Okay, the next term is the officers. They're members of the executive board voted in by the other executive board members to serve as like president, secretary, treasurer, and in some cases a vice president. As far as board members, there might be anywhere between 3 and I've seen up to 11 board members. Okay, the next term is the manager or a management company. There might be a management or management company. A few condominiums hire a manager on their own, and that person becomes an employee of the condominium. Other condominiums hire a management company. If the condominium is large, that management company may place a manager on site. There are a lot of credentials that a manager may have. Okay, some smaller condominiums are self-managed. That means the executive board handles all the day-to-day management responsibilities. I'm also going to mention another term, Community Association Institute. The Community Association Institute is a national organization with a subsidiary in each state. It provides services to condominium managers and executive boards. While it's estimated that there's over 6,800 community associations in Pennsylvania, the Community Association Institute will not tell us what percentage of those associations are members of the CAI, but I'm going to guess that it's less than 25%. However, even though they don't have more than 25% members, the CAI is important for the fact that it has a PAC, a political action committee. It has a great deal of say in the legislation that's passed in Pennsylvania. In the opinion of some, they block reform legislation that would protect homeowners. They also have a listserv of executive board members throughout the nation. And if you're a board member, you can join this listserv, you can network, you can pose questions, you can ask for information. Last time I was on the listserv, there were 50,000 other people on the listserv. Whatever question you had regarding your condominium or HOA, there was an answer by somebody who had already handled that same issue once or more before. So while I might not always agree with the philosophy of the Community Association Institute, I must admit, as an accountant, that they have a really good business model. What they do is they match HOA board members with vendors who can provide services to HOAs. Services like trash removal, roofing, engineering, even legal and accounting services. Last time I read the financial report of our local chapter, it was apparent that they also derive a lot of funds by hosting expos where executive board members can meet vendors. But the CAI also provides training to executive board members who are willing to take the time to learn. I did get a certificate as a board leader, and I must admit, I learned things during that course that made me a better board leader. While we're on the CAI, I'll also mention that they have a group of lawyers called the College of Community Association Lawyers. Now, not every HOA or condominium in Pennsylvania hires an attorney that's a member of the college, but the lawyers who are in that college also network with each other, and they all specialize in the field. While I don't always agree with them, I've had the opportunity to use their services when I served as the president of our community association, and I respect them for what they do. One thing that you should be clear about if you purchase into a condominium is that the condominium attorney represents the condominium association through the board. That means that the condominium attorney doesn't represent the unit owners, but represents the association through the board. They're going to endeavor to support the board whenever possible. Okay, as far as management companies go, there are some large management companies that are national in scope. They have over 7,500 HOAs that they manage. Some of them are companies like Associa, First Service Residential, but then there's also local companies. All right, having going over the people involved, I'm going to go over the 3 key categories of property in a condominium. The first is what's called private elements. This is the interior of your unit. It's your living room, your bedroom, kitchen, your bathroom. These are yours to use and control, subject to some minor restrictions. For example, there might be a rule that says 80% or more of your floor must have a carpet over it in order to cut down noise from the person beneath you. You might be prohibited from blocking ventilation ducts in the condo that help circulate air throughout the building. But otherwise, you can pretty much decorate and alter your premises as desired. If you want to redecorate your kitchen or bathroom, go ahead. You're able to do so, as long as you pay the cost yourself. You can hang pictures on your walls. You can have as many guests as the local building code will permit, and you don't need to renew any lease. You pay 100% of the costs of upkeep for the private elements that you own. Another feature in condominium is something called common elements. These are the parts of the property that's owned collectively by all residents. Examples include the lobby, the hallways, the elevators, the roofs, landscaping, driveways, any recreational facilities. Everyone pays for the upkeep of the common elements, whether you personally use them or not. If you live on the first floor, you must still help pay for the elevators and the roof. However, with shared ownership, you may have access to many more amenities than you could afford alone. You pay a percentage of the costs of the common elements equal to your percentage of ownership interest. And as we said earlier, your ownership interest is determined by the amount of square footage you own. The declaration has the actual percentage interest for each and every unit, and oftentimes it carries it out to 4 or 5 decimal places. Okay, the last property type that we're going to mention is something called a limited common element. These fall somewhere in between the 2 previous ones we've discussed. They're technically owned by everyone in the condominium, but their use is reserved for one or a few residents. The balcony attached to your unit is a good example. So might be an assigned parking space or a storage locker that's been assigned to you. So the condominium reserves the use of your balcony only to you, or the use of the parking spot only to you. But the condominium association is responsible for the upkeep of those areas. In some cases, the allocation of expenses is divided among those who benefit from the limited common element. In other cases, everyone in the condominium complex pays for the upkeep. These are items that are spelled out in the declaration to the condominium. So why does this matter? Because the way ownership is divided determines your rights and responsibilities. It affects what you can change or modify, what you must maintain, and what you must pay for. Some sources of dispute might involve things like a soil pipe that services the toilet of the owner above you. If that soil pipe begins to leak and damages the roof of your unit, who's responsible for the repair? The condominium, you, or the owner above? The declaration will tell you that. In our condominium, we have an indoor garage that houses 110 cars and an upper deck to the garage open to any unit owner or visitor. The indoor spaces are designated as limited common elements. The upper deck is a common element. When the garage needed $500,000 worth of repairs, there was a dispute about whether indoor garage space owners or everyone had to pay for the repairs. Therefore, understanding the structure of the declaration is essential. Many people assume that condo ownership is like owning a single home. It's not. It's a partnership. Whether you like it or not, you're a partner with all the other owners and with the board that manages the community. Okay, so let's talk about some of the advantages of condominium ownership. Why do people purchase condominiums? Well, there are several good reasons. The first is low maintenance. Owners are typically responsible for repairs inside their units, but exterior maintenance like the roofs, the landscaping, the snow removal, the driveway maintenance, All that's handled by the association. So in our condo, whenever it snows, that's not our problem. Our landscaper has every road cleared when the accumulation reaches up to 2 inches, and he has some members of his staff remain on the premises throughout any storm. Also, some members of our staff will remove the snow that may be on our car. We give them a small tip. In our condo, if your auto battery doesn't start your car, we have a jump starter in the garage that the staff will bring to you and get you going. And speaking of electrical, we purchase our electricity at wholesale rates and include it in our monthly fees. But the best feature is how inexpensive and quick maintenance can take. So some semi-retired members of our maintenance staff work on the side to perform repairs. When I had to replace the garbage disposal in our unit, we hired a member of our maintenance staff who had done that job dozens of times before, and he completed the job in less than an hour. And then we do have things that our maintenance staff will perform on behalf of the condominium for a flat fee. The second big draw about condominiums is the amenities. Many condominiums offer swimming pools, tennis courts, saunas, gardens, community rooms, and much more. Imagine living where you can swim, play tennis, use a health club just steps away from your unit. During the summer, for example, I try to quit work early, maybe about 3 o'clock. We head to our heated pool by 3:30. We go for a swim. There's usually a lifeguard on duty at the end of the day, and we have barbecues. The maintenance staff of the condo keeps the barbecues fueled up, and at the end of every day, they clean all the barbecues. After we go for our swim, we will pop open a bottle of wine, put something on the barbecue, enjoy dinner with our guests or our neighbors. We put tables together and have dinner together. Sometimes we'll celebrate a birthday party for some unit owner, and the staff will bring out folding tables so everyone can sit together. When the pool closes in the evening, we just walk from the pool back to our condo and settle in for the evening. But then other evenings, the pool stays open late and we show movies at the pool. Our condominium has a van that'll bring you to the train station, to nearby medical centers for if you have a doctor's appointment, to the shopping centers. And our driver will help you get your groceries from your shopping cart at the grocery store into the van. Once at the condo, our staff, if you ask them, they'll bring your groceries up to your unit, if that's what you want them to do. Another aspect about condominiums is security. Some condominiums provide a doorman. Some have gatehouses, surveillance cameras, a security staff. For many people, this brings real peace of mind. Also, if I'm locked out of my unit because I forgot my keys, I call security. They're right on the premises. They can get me right in. But on the other hand, nobody can get past our front gate unless I tell the gatekeeper and the doorman to let them in. Another feature I'll quickly mention is that we have teens in the condo. For them, the condominium is a paradise. After dinner, they do what normal teens do. They meet up and hang out somewhere on the campus. For the parents, there's the comfort knowing the kids are nearby and that the security staff is there if there's an emergency. And then we have a package room. We don't have to worry about porch pilots. Amazon, UPS, and other deliveries are brought to the package room. They're signed in. They're kept safe. When a package comes for us, we get us an email telling us the package is waiting for us in the package room, and then we sign it out. If it's a large package and we need help, the staff will help us get it to our unit. And then maybe one of the biggest draws is community life. We have social activities almost every day of the year. We have movie nights, parades during the holidays. We have discussion groups, parties. It's very easy to meet your neighbors and feel like part of something larger. In our condo, residents meet in the TV room to watch football, sometimes baseball games. We have a large 72-inch TV with a sound bar. Everyone brings a snack to share. We have sit and fit for the seniors in the mornings. We have bingo games. Some evenings we have movie night. We have movies at the pool, as I mentioned. We have line dancing. We celebrate everybody. We celebrate the birthday parties of each month, the anniversaries that people have in each month. We have a Halloween party with prizes. We have trips. where all you need to go is to the front door and meet and board the bus. We will sometimes go down to the shore in one of the buses. We'll go into the water. We return home in our bathing suits. It doesn't matter, because when the bus comes, we just get out of the bus and walk up to our unit. We have a community garden for those who want more than a balcony for their plants. We have a social committee, a recreation club, a resident life community. And finally, condominiums offer affordability and convenience. In some markets, condos are a lower entry point to home ownership. They also appeal to frequent travelers or to retirees who don't want to be burdened with maintaining a house. So for all these reasons, people find condominium living ideal. But there are also significant risks. Okay, I would not be entirely honest if I didn't mention some of the pitfalls and risks of condominium ownership. Let's turn to the other side of the equation. What are the flaws of condominium ownership? First, developer issues. Condominiums are created by developers who want to build, sell, and move on. To make units attractive, the developers may set the initial condo fees artificially low based on the operating expenses for the upcoming year. They won't charge enough to fund reserves for long-term repairs, such as replacing the roof in 10 years, or the driveways in 15 years, or the boiler in 20 years. Then, once the developer sells all the units, the developer disappears, leaving the unit owners to deal with the consequences. After the developer's gone, the new board may have to then convince the unit owners that they need to raise the condo fees to replace the things like that roof in 10 years or the boiler in 20 years. A second drawback with condominiums is there are volunteer boards. Condos are usually managed by an executive board made up of volunteers. Some are skilled and conscientious. Others lack basic business or financial experience. They're folks who would certainly never get a job in a real estate rental company. And yet, their boards may manage budgets that are in the millions of dollars. Some board members may never have managed a budget at all. Another issue is political pressures. Because boards are elected, they face political pressure. Raising fees is very unpopular, so the boards sometimes keep them low at the cost of deferring maintenance. But then sooner or later the bill comes due and the owners will face a special assessment. These special assessments can run into tens of thousands of dollars per unit. The next drawback is deferred maintenance. There are a few boards who operate on the principle of don't fix it till it breaks. So instead of setting money aside for future repairs, they rely on insurance when things go wrong. This can backfire badly. Next drawback is the management companies. Many condos hire outside management firms. Some are excellent. Others prioritize keeping the contract with the condominium and not solving problems. See, each management company probably has the manager of your condominium, who then has to report to a regional director, who then has to appoint to another director. And if they lose the contract, they have to explain that to all the higher-ups. So to get around this, some management companies place a waiver of liability clause in the contracts with the condominium. So they're not liable for any of their negligence, and they do whatever the board asks them to do, knowing they don't have to bear the consequences. And finally, there might be personality conflicts. I mean, boards are made up of people. Sometimes some of these people lack customer service skills or leadership skills, or even basic civility. In worst cases, they create a hostile environment that drives away staff and residents. But even if the board does get along, there might be 4 or 5 or 7 executive board members and 1 condo manager. It's so hard to get things done. At the typical board meeting, everyone has to say something about every proposal. If there are 7 board members and each of them speak for 5 minutes each, it takes 35 minutes to consider any topic on the agenda. So a board can meet for 2, 3, 4 hours and accomplish very little. And finally, the executive board usually hires an attorney to assist them. As I said before, the attorney for the condominium works for the corporation. And that may cause friction between unit owners and the attorney. So in short, while condominiums offer tremendous benefits, They can also become financial traps or sources of stress. The difference lies in how they're managed and whether you as a buyer know what to look for. The purpose of my presentation is to help you find the best condominiums among the offerings. Okay, so now let's go over some of the governing documents and the state laws. When you buy a condominium, you agree to live under a set of governing documents and state laws that give you certain rights. These are legally binding when you live there, so let's review them. The first is the declaration. As I mentioned earlier, this is the foundational legal document. It defines what is a private element, what's a limited common element, what's a common element. It specifies your share of expenses, your voting rights, and your responsibilities. It may regulate pets, renovations, the lease of units, any easements that exist, even the color of your drapes if they're visible from the outside. The declaration is filed with the county recorder of deeds. Every deed in the condominium refers back to that declaration. It usually takes a vote of more than 2/3 of unit owners to change the declaration, and if they succeed, then notice of that amendment must be filed with every deed. In some cases, with smaller condominiums, it's relatively easy to change the declaration, but in larger communities, it can be very difficult. Next are the bylaws. The bylaws outline how the condominium is governed, how meetings are called, how the board is elected, how many votes are needed to pass certain measures, and the duties of the officers. They may specify the date of the annual meeting for the condominium. They may specify the date when the budget for the next year is due from the board. The bylaws will also have the duties of the officers. There may be 7 members of the executive board, for example, but only 3 may be officers, like a president, secretary, or treasurer. In some cases, the Uniform Condominium Act may take precedence over the bylaws. So, for example, the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act was amended to require that any elections for condominiums of over 500 units must be overseen by a licensed Pennsylvania accountant, attorney, or private vote counting company. The Uniform Condominium Act was also amended to detail what's necessary to recall executive directors despite anything to the contrary in any declaration. All right, the final internal governing document is the rules or the owner's manual. These are the day-to-day lifestyle regulations. For example, what days of the week or hours of the day you can perform noisy construction, whether you can have wind chimes on your balcony, how you must dispose of your trash, whether you can grill on your balcony. Unfortunately, the rules and regulations frequently catch new owners off guard because they didn't know about those rules before they moved in. And the rules and regulations are often the source of most disputes because boards might enforce them without giving the alleged offender an opportunity to be heard, and yet that's required by the Uniform Condominium Act. Pennsylvania courts have struck down rules that are only selectively enforced or rules that are arbitrary. There are numerous Facebook groups where unit owners tell stories of boards that have done some truly outrageous things. It's important to keep in mind that even though a vote of 2/3 or more of unit owners is required to amend the declaration or bylaws, the executive board alone can change the rules with or without owner input. All right, now having gone over the internal rules that govern condominiums, we'll go over the external rules. In Pennsylvania, the main laws are the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act and the Pennsylvania Nonprofit Corporation Law. The Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act. Well, Pennsylvania is one of 14 states that have adopted what's called the Uniform Condominium Act. The other states are Alabama, Arizona, Kentucky, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, New Mexico, Rhode Island, Texas, Virginia, Washington, and West Virginia. This framework, statutory framework, was approved by the American Bar Association and the Uniform Law Commissioners in 1978. But a lot has happened, and we've learned a lot since 1978, yet only a few amendments have been made to the law since then. I mean, each year there are amendments that are proposed in the Pennsylvania legislature, but they seldom make it out of committee. I'm working with a group of concerned unit owners to pass a Transparency Act in Pennsylvania, which would, among other things, require that all board meetings be open to unit owners and that unit owners be made aware of the board meeting agenda for any upcoming board meetings. See, some states require that condominium executive board meetings be open to all unit owners, but Pennsylvania does not at this time. All right, the Condominium Act deals with the creation, alteration, management, and termination of condominiums. However, there's one subsection that deals with the rights of purchasers and unit owners that should be known to all consumer advocates and attorneys, and it's Section 3412 of the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act. It provides, if a declarant or any other person subject to this subpart, meaning the Uniform Condominium Act, violates any provision thereof or any provision of the declaration or bylaws, any person or class of persons adversely affected by the violation has a claim for appropriate relief. Punitive damages might be awarded in the case of a willful violation of the subpart, and if appropriate, the prevailing party may be entitled to an award of costs and reasonable attorney fees. Now, there are only a handful of cases, very few reported cases where this statute was used, but I did come across one case earlier this year where a unit owner was successful in litigation against an HOA, and the unit owner was awarded $50,000 in legal fees plus reimbursement of the costs. There are some firms in Florida that handle these cases exclusively, but not very many in Pennsylvania yet. I could devote a separate course to the Uniform Condominium Act. Another important provision of the Act is that a unit owner is entitled to inspect all records of the condominium. So the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act, Section 3316 says, all financial and other records shall be made reasonably available for examination by any unit owner and his authorized agents. A condominium may also be governed by the Pennsylvania Nonprofit Corporation Act. This act applies to condominiums that are nonprofit corporations. Although most condominiums fall within this group, not all do. And this law is found in Title 15. The parts of the Nonprofit Corporation Act that pertain to condominiums usually provide access to records, and these apply in addition to the provisions of the Uniform Condominium Act that we just reviewed. So Section 1808B of the Nonprofit Corporation Act states, it talks about the right of inspection by a shareholder. It says, on demand, in compliance with the requirements of subsection B1, a shareholder has the right to examine in person or by agent or attorney during usual hours for business for any proper purpose the share register, books and records of account, and minutes of and consents in lieu of meetings by the incorporator, shareholders, and directors, and to make copies and extracts therefrom. The subsection says that a demand has to be made in writing, and there's some other minor specifications that have to be adhered to. Now, while the rights under the Pennsylvania Nonprofit Corporation Act they're not as strong as the rights under the Uniform Condominium Act, but it does provide additional support for any unit owner who wants to inspect records. One thing I'm going to mention before leaving the Nonprofit Corporation Act, there are a few unit owners who suggest bringing an action against their executive board for a breach of fiduciary duty or mismanagement of the condominium, and they try to do this under the Pennsylvania Nonprofit Corporation Act. It's hard to do that because there's a section 5717 and a court case in Philadelphia which would seem to say that this kind of case can only be brought as what's called a shareholder derivative suit. That means you have to go through more hoops. So sometimes if an executive board of your condominium is underperforming or not performing properly, the easiest thing to do is mount an opposition at the next election. Okay, one thing before I leave this section about the rights of unit owners, I want to mention one other issue that sometimes comes up in condominiums and HOAs, and it's the right of unit owners to communicate with each other. There are some condominiums that restrict the right to communicate substantially. While the members of any condominium or HOA can establish a Facebook group to communicate or can get on Nextdoor or whatever, there's no obligation for an executive board of a condominium or HOA to provide any kind of bulletin board or other means of communication among unit owners. Now, unit owners will often fight back by accusing the management of restricting their First Amendment right of free speech, but an HOA is not a governmental entity. Only governmental entities are subject to the provisions of First Amendment free speech. So an HOA can restrict the right to communicate and speak. On the other hand, it's often overlooked that the Pennsylvania Constitution provides a broader right to free speech than the U.S. Constitution. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody has tested condominium or HOA speech restrictions under the Pennsylvania Constitution. I'm hoping that sometime somebody does. So the bottom line message I'm trying to convey is that when you buy into a condominium, you agree to abide by these documents and laws. It's crucial that you understand and read them in advance. So to repeat what I said earlier, when you buy into a condominium, you're buying more than a personal living space. You're also buying a percentage interest in an ongoing business. And please don't forget what I said earlier. There are some condominiums that are properly managed, so all these issues never arise. The purpose of my presentation is to help you find those really good condominiums. Okay, so now we're going to get into the most important part of this presentation, and it's about the critical 3407 package. The 3407 package is named after Section 3407 of the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act. It requires sellers to provide prospective buyers with a disclosure package. This package contains a preface and 17 specific items of information about the condominium that must be given to a buyer prior to purchase. Now, Section 3407 pertains to resales of units from one condominium unit owner who's selling to another condominium unit owner. It does not pertain to the sale of units from the original developer. When the initial developer sells units, they have to abide by a more comprehensive statement called the public offering statement. That's the topic of an entirely different presentation. Here we're dealing only with the sale of a condominium by a present unit owner to a new unit owner. Now, in theory, this 3407 package is designed to protect prospective purchasers. In practice, many buyers don't know their rights, nor do they know how important the information is to read it. Oftentimes they don't read it at all, or they read it too late. Usually they'll read it after they've already committed to a sales contract. And then sometimes people read it and they don't understand it. So the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominiums Act states that after a seller requests the 3407 package from the management of a condominium, the management must provide it to the seller within 12 days. However, the seller, the person who's selling the unit to you, is not liable in any way for any erroneous statements contained in that 3407 package, insofar as it pertains to common elements. This is stated not only in the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act, but also in the state laws requiring disclosures by sellers of any material defects in property they sell. While the seller may remain responsible for disclosing any defects in the condominium unit they're selling, any disclosure of problems in the common elements or the condominium corporation itself are the responsibility of the condominium to disclose. And they need only disclose what's required by Section 3407. Honestly, in the years I've been involved in condominiums, I've noticed a shockingly large number of real estate agents, unit owners, and even some condominium executive board members who don't understand the contents of that 3407 package. What they do is they delegate drafting the package to the lawyer for the HOA or the management company with little or no supervision. I know of a condominium where parts of the declaration were omitted from the 3407 package for years, and nobody ever noticed it because nobody had read the 3407 package. Now, there are some barriers to the practical usefulness of the 3407 package. I'm going to let you know so that they don't fall in the way of your getting information. If you know these barriers in advance, you can avoid them. I've already said that one problem with the 3407 package is that it's hard to read and understand. It sometimes refers back to other provisions or laws that the common lay person can't locate, let alone understand. I'm going to cover those difficult sections in this presentation, and hopefully you'll understand everything if you follow my presentation. If you're still confused, it would behoove you to retain the services of an experienced real estate attorney. All right, so let's go back to the 3407 package. The way the statute is drafted can present a problem if you're not aware of it. The Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act requires that a 3407 package be provided to a purchaser, quote, before execution of any contract for sale of a unit or otherwise before conveyance. Now, in the best case scenario, the 3407 package is provided to the prospective purchaser before they execute any agreement of sale for the property. But all too often, especially for those who haven't taken this course, the package is delivered to them the day before or the morning of the conveyance. It only needs to be provided before conveyance according to the law, and some sellers take advantage of this loophole. But after you finish this course, you're going to know better. You will remind the seller of the property that you're looking at that the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act allows you to examine the Section 3407 package, quote, before execution of any contract, end quote. In many cases, since the seller has to pay a few $100s to the condominium association to prepare the package, the seller won't provide that 3407 package until after an agreement of sale has been signed. And by that time, you might have paid money to a mortgage company, you might be committed to a real estate agent for a commission, and you might have even paid for an inspection of the private elements. And it's hard to get out of the agreement if that's the case. So you want to try to get it before you sign any agreement of sale. But even if you've already signed the agreement of sale, the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act does provide an opportunity to void the sale if the 3407 package has any information that you consider bad. Section 3407D says that you can void any purchase contract for a condominium until you receive that 3407 package and for 5 days thereafter, or until conveyance, whichever first occurs. So if you've signed an agreement of sale for a condominium but not yet received the 3407 package, you can void the purchase. And once you receive that 3407 package, you have 5 days to examine it, and you can void the purchase during that time without forfeiting any money. But once you go to conveyance or settlement, you lose that right to void the agreement. So if you receive the 3407 package the morning of the conveyance or settlement, and you transfer the deed anyway, you've lost important protections. Let me restate this. If you have signed an agreement of sale with a proposed settlement day of, let's say, December 1st, and you haven't received the 3407 package at least 5 days before the conveyance date, which they also sometimes call the settlement date, then you should definitely void the purchase. If you don't do that and you go to the conveyance or settlement anyway, you've lost the protections intended by Section 3407. Now that you know to request that 3407 package early, let's go over all the elements in that 3407 package. Let's first talk about the preface to Section 3407. The preface to Section 3407 states, if one unit owner resells his or her unit to another, they must provide the intended purchaser with a copy of the declaration, other than plats and plans, the bylaws, the rules and regulations of the association, plus 17 other items that we're going to go over shortly. Now, we've already defined the declaration, bylaws, and the rules and regulations earlier. Section 3407 states that it's optional for the seller to provide copies of plats and plans as part of the declaration. Well, the plats and plans are the physical dimensions and description of the boundaries of the condominium. If most times they are in the declaration. If they're not, then if it's at all possible, you should try to obtain a copy of these documents. Most time, you can ask management if there are copies around somewhere. There probably are. So I recently represented the unit owner where there was a dispute with the management over who was responsible to repair a pipe that had gone bad. We had to look to the plats and plans to find out who owned that pipe. All right, so you definitely want to read all the documents before you purchase. For example, you don't want to buy a condominium where pets are prohibited if you have a pet dog. You don't want to purchase a unit for later rental if the rentals are prohibited in that condominium. Do the rules and regulations regulate the number or the age of guests you can bring to the swimming pool? You won't know until you read them. You don't want to purchase a condominium where your grandchildren can't come and use the pool with you. All right, so you avoid that problem by reading the 3407 package. Let's go over the 17 other items. Item number 1 is a statement disclosing the effect of the proposed disposition of any right of first refusal or other restraint on the free alienability of the unit. Okay, what's this mean? This means the seller has to disclose if there are any restrictions, such as a right of first refusal, that would limit you, the buyer's ability to freely sell or transfer the unit later. So there are some condominiums where in order to stabilize the sales price of the units, any seller has to first offer the unit to the condominium itself for purchase. This protects the value of the units, but this may also limit the ability of you, after you buy the unit, it may limit your ability to determine who's going to receive your property. If you intended to sell the property to your brother at a reduced price in 10 years, the declaration may limit your ability to choose the buyer of the property. And of course, remember, if the association does have a right of first refusal on a property that you're considering for purchase, then you really want to make sure that the seller complied with that provision and offered it to the condominium for sale at first. There might be other restraints on transfer, and if there are, you'll find them here. It's not likely you'll find a restraint like that, but if it is, you'll find it in this section of the 3407. The next item, item number 2, a statement setting forth the amount of the monthly common expense assessment and any unpaid common expense or special assessment currently due and payable from the selling unit owner, and any surplus fund credits to be applied with regard to the unit pursuant to section 3313 relating to surplus funds. So this is one of those sections that refers back to another law that very few people fully understand. Simply stated, this section says that a seller has to tell the buyer, you, how much the regular condo fees are. Condo fees are also known as common expenses. They have to disclose any unpaid condo fees that the seller owes, because any unpaid fees could become your liability if they're still unpaid. As to the credits, well, under the Pennsylvania condominium law, if there's a surplus in the operating budget at the end of the year, the executive board has to either return that surplus to unit owners or transfer it to the capital fund or reserve fund. In nearly every case that I know of, the balance has been transferred to the capital fund or reserve fund rather than returned to unit owners. So it's not likely you're going to run across a credit that's due to the condo owner. If there are delinquencies on condo fees in the unit which is being offered for sale, then the buyer's title company is typically going to satisfy that delinquency from the seller's proceeds at settlement. I'm sorry, so your title insurance company will satisfy those delinquencies from the amount that the seller receives at settlement, so that you're not responsible for them. Not only does this happen when there's delinquencies because of the financial hardships of the seller, but if you're buying a condo from an estate, oftentimes what happens is the estate will tell the condo association that they'll get all the delinquent fees paid when the property sells, and they don't pay anything while the estate's going through probate. Okay, so be aware of that. If there is amount that's owed, it will be on this section of the 3407 package. Before we leave this section, we need to explore terms called common assessment and special assessment. We need to go a little bit deeper into these terms. These are very important topics. As I said earlier, the amount of the common expense assessment that you will have to pay depends on the square footage of your unit over the square footage of all the units. The amount of any common expense assessment differs very widely among condominiums. In our condominium, it covers all the utilities, even the utilities in your private unit. See, we purchase our utilities at a wholesale rate, and it saves a significant amount of money for everyone. We do not measure each individual unit's use of the utilities, and this works so long as we can maintain that team spirit to conserve energy. Our common expense assessment also covers things like the bus that I mentioned earlier that's owned by our condominium. It pays for our heated swimming pool, our outdoor pools, our health club, the parking lots, the meeting room, many meeting rooms that we have, and other items. You not only want to know what your monthly common expense assessment is, but you also want to know what it covers. If you will never be using a swimming pool or a health club, do you mind paying fees each month to help maintain them? That's why I said the monthly assessment fees differ, or the condo fees differ widely among condominiums. And also the range of things they cover differs widely. You should not simply compare condo fees of one condo against the condo fees of another. You should also compare what you receive in return for those fees. But we also see another term in this subsection, and it's called the special assessment. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that I was an accountant. Now I'm going to put on my accountant's hat as I define this term special assessment. A special assessment is an amount of money due because in earlier years the condominium underestimated the cost of operating the business. You see, one of the fundamental principles of accounting is that a business should match revenue earned with expenses incurred in the period in which the revenue was earned and the expenses were incurred. And expenses include not only the current expenses, but also any amounts that should be set aside to replace the major assets, such as the roof, the driveway, parking lots, plumbing systems, the boilers, and other long-term capital assets. I think that any accountant will verify the fact that most businesses don't survive past 10 or 15 years. And one of the major reasons for this is that they fail to set aside money to replace the capital assets. And when a capital asset fails, a major capital asset fails, and they can't obtain financing for its replacement, they file for bankruptcy. However, condominiums are different. If they underestimate the needed money from previous years, they don't file for bankruptcy, but instead they impose on unit owners something called a special assessment. So, for example, there's a condominium in Philadelphia where they had to replace major plumbing pipes, and a special assessment was imposed on each unit owner between $20,000 and $30,000. The condominium in which I live is probably facing a special assessment in the coming years. Now, some states have begun to enact laws that require that reserves be set aside by the condominium to replace major assets and for repairs. But until that happens, special assessments are likely to be the norm, as more condominiums age and find that they haven't put aside money to replace capital assets. If the unit you intend to purchase must pay a special assessment, you want to know how much it is, but you also want to know how many years you have to pay it. Is it going to be a special assessment for just 1 year, or will it be due over the next 2, 3, 5, or 10 years? Okay, item number 3 of the 3407 package, a statement of any other fees payable by unit owners. Any other fees that an owner must pay beyond the normal monthly assessments have to be disclosed. Now, there's no official policy with regard to how deep the disclosure must go, and it varies among condominiums. For example, in our condominium, you might be responsible for some of the additional fees. So every unit owner has to pay 2 months common expense assessment in advance when they purchase a unit. We also have a move-in fee and a move-out fee of $300. This covers a staff member who provides extra security while your moving truck is at the loading dock. It provides for protective coverings that are put over hallway carpets and other small amenities. We also have a $50 monthly fee to use our health club, a $300 annual fee to use our outdoor pool. If you want to rent one of our large rooms for a birthday party or bar mitzvah or wedding celebration, there are differing fees depending on the size of the room. Now, in theory, a condominium purchaser shouldn't be held liable for undisclosed fees. However, in practice, the legal costs of challenging that would outweigh the fees themselves. So for this reason, what you should do is ask detailed questions of management about any extra fees before purchasing a condo unit. You might want to inquire whether or not there's a price list circulating somewhere, because there probably is. Item number 4, a statement of any capital expenditures proposed by the association for the current and next 2 succeeding fiscal years. This might be one of the most crucial pieces of information in the 3407 package. Before purchasing the unit, you should determine whether the HOA plans to spend money for major repairs during the current fiscal year or the next 2 fiscal years. For example, if an HOA intends to replace internal piping, plumbing piping, over a 2-year period at a cost of $10 million, it's crucial that you know this beforehand. If there's not enough money in the capital reserve account, this means that every unit owner will be forced to pay a special assessment. However, take this provision with a grain of salt and investigate further. Many boards are of the opinion that if they haven't passed an official resolution authorizing a capital repair, then they're not required to disclose it. So everybody in the condominium may know that they're facing a $30 or $60 million repair job to replace riser pipes, the pipes that supply water to the heating and air conditioning, or they may know that there's a $2 million expense coming up to replace the fire alarm system because the township has been on them about this, but yet that doesn't show up anywhere in the 3407 package because the board did not specifically pass a resolution authorizing it. So the only way you can find out about that is to ask management, but in the subsequent parts of this presentation, I'm going to tell you about other ways you can discover about major asset expenses. But looking here is the first step. Item number 5, a statement of the amount of any reserves for capital expenditures and any portions of those reserves designated by the association for any specific project. Now, in theory, you should receive a concise accounting statement that contains the information specified above. In practice, it doesn't always happen. To satisfy this first step, you need to examine the balance sheet for the condominium that's given to you as part of the 3407 package. You'll see an operating account, a capital account, and possibly a reserve account. Look at the amounts in the capital account and the reserve account because they're going to be the money that's used to satisfy any obligations for major repairs in the future. Now, rather than tell you the amount of any reserves designated by the association for any specific project, what you're probably going to receive is a copy of something that's called an asset reserve study. This is a study conducted by engineers who specialize in that type of service. What they do is they look at every single item that the condo owns. The asset reserve study is going to indicate the useful life of every item owned as a common element in the condominium. It's going to also specify when that should be replaced and what the cost will be to replace it. It typically indicates how much must be in the reserve account on a year-by-year basis for the next 20 or 30 years. All you have to do is compare what's in the reserve account with what should be required under the asset reserve study. If there's a gap between the two figures, that's probably going to have to be made up as a special assessment as the major components begin to fail. Now, rarely does a board ever designate a portion of the reserves for one or more projects. Rather, what they do is they accept bids on projects, and then they simply take the money from the reserve account to pay the person when they've finished the bidding. Sometimes even the unit owners are in the dark about what the board is doing. Best practices for a condominium would be to prepare an asset reserve study every 4 years. And that's what it used to be, where there was one completed every 4 years. However, more recently, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, organizations who underwrite about 70% of the private purchase mortgages, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have asked that an asset reserve study be done every 3 years. But even if it's not, even if there's no asset reserve study in the 3407 package, you want to inquire of management whether or not there's an asset reserve study that's been completed in the past. All right, two things we're going to talk about with the asset reserve study. If management will not give you a copy of it, they say it's only available to unit owners, then you ask the seller to get it, because the seller is entitled to a copy of it. Another caveat about asset reserve studies is that sometimes they don't cover assets or things that are concealed behind walls, for example. So I know of a condominium where they had a problem with pipes that were behind walls, but it was impossible to inspect those pipes during the asset reserve study. The pipes began to fail, and the cost to replace them was like $180,000 per pipe. If you're sophisticated enough, go through the asset reserve study and try to figure out what's missing and what's there. Another thing that you may run into, it's becoming more prevalent, is a new concept where the condominium enters into a long-term maintenance contract with a company that specializes in these services. So for example, it doesn't happen often, but it's beginning to happen. So for example, the Amtrak train station in Center City, Philadelphia, is under a 50-year maintenance contract with a company called Johnson Controls. Johnson Controls is willing to make purchases of major capital assets because they know they can write off that purchase over 50 years, because that's how long they have the contract to maintain the property. This is a relatively new concept. It's not widespread, but you may see it. All right, number 6. You're entitled to the most recent regularly prepared balance sheet and income and expense statement, if any, of the association. Well, first I have to tell you that the institution really must have a balance sheet and an income and expense statement. Management must prepare a budget every year. They usually need to have a balance sheet and an income statement if they're going to do that. I know this seems relatively straightforward, but I want to mention one issue that might come up. Management might supply you with an audited income statement and balance sheet, and depending upon what month of the year your client is purchasing the property, it may or may not be dated. You should remind management that the rule does not mandate an audited balance sheet and income and expense statement, but only the most recent regularly prepared statements. Most time, management or the management company will provide the executive board with monthly financials so that the executive board can compare the actual expenses with the budget, and you should ask for a copy of that if it's available. Usually there's one out there. Usually there's a PDF copy of recent financial statements somewhere. Okay, next. The next component of the 3407 package is the current operating budget of the association. Well, what happens is that every year the board drafts a budget for the next operating year so that the unit owners know in advance how much money they'll be paying for the common expense assessment and any special assessments for the next year. In Pennsylvania, only the executive board votes on the budget, and then unit owners have a limited time after that to veto. In many cases, the budget is passed months before the next year of operation, so that people can budget their personal expenses. So in addition to receiving the current operating budget, which is mandated by Section 3407, you may want to ask and see if you can see a copy of any budget for any upcoming year if it's been completed, and see how much the common expense assessment will increase over the upcoming year. If the management says there is one such budget, but they won't provide it to you, then the seller has to have a copy because they already voted on it. And they can also obtain a copy through the management office if they lost theirs. So if there is another budget that covers the next operating year, which is already being completed, you should be able to get your hands on it. All right, the next item is a statement of any judgments against the association and the status of any pending lawsuits to which the association is a party. Again, compliance with this provision differs among HOAs. Some HOAs don't list anything. Other HOAs will list outstanding court cases, but not matters such as EEOC hearings or outstanding code enforcement complaints by the township, even though, the township is requesting a $2 million upgrade to the fire alarm system. It's always a good practice to not only look at this item and what's provided in the 3407 package, but also to, by using your computer, perform an electronic search through the county prothonotary office. Do a case search and try to find any currently outstanding cases against the HOA or the condominium, as well as past cases. So if you see a lot of foreclosure cases for delinquent condo fees, you know that this particular condominium or HOA is having a problem with meeting the cash needs requirement, and that some condo owners are not paying, and it's going into foreclosure. Also, there may be, we'll talk about a provision where unit owners might be entitled to damages if the board or management blatantly violates provisions of the Declaration or the Uniform Condo Act. You should look for cases like that. Some of them might be class action cases. And then one thing I'll mention before leaving this, I just mentioned nearly every management contract between a management company and an HOA or a condominium contains a waiver of liability clause that protects the management company from negligence. Now, the management company is not required to give you a copy of any management contract, but there's no harm in asking. And then maybe your client can get your client is certainly entitled to a copy of it. I'm sorry, the seller is certainly entitled to a copy of it, and maybe they can obtain it for you. Okay. Excuse me. The next provision is a statement describing any insurance coverage provided for the benefit of unit owners. Typically, what you'll get to satisfy this condition is a copy of the insurance declaration page. At least that's what our HOA provides. We hope that the prospective unit owner understands that, but I've seen it myself and it's pretty complicated. So in our HOA, we spend several $100,000 a year for insurance that covers our motor vehicles, covers property hazards, workers' comp, directors, E&O coverage. We even have terrorism coverage in case someone hacks into our computer system. And on top of everything else, we have an umbrella policy. You certainly want to be sure that the condominium or HOA has insurance, and just try to understand as much as you can about the insurance coverage that's provided. It's a good sign if they have several different insurance policies. All right, the next item is a statement whether the executive board has knowledge that any alterations or improvements to the unit or the limited common elements assigned thereto violate any provision of the declaration. There we need to step back for a moment and define another term. We already talked about what a declaration is. The declaration may state that in any alteration, okay, next, a limited common element. A limited common element is a common element that's where one person has exclusive use of it. The classic case is the balcony that's attached to a condominium. The condominium owner adjacent to that balcony has exclusive rights to the use of that balcony. It's called a limited common element. Another example of a limited common element might be if there's a parking garage and there are assigned parking spaces, then those parking spaces are called limited common elements because although they're owned by the condominium association, only one condo owner has a right to them. So that's what a limited common element is. But an issue that comes up with regard to these alterations, an issue that comes up in our condominium is that we have ventilation vents in the kitchen and the bathroom. And it's essential that those vents always be open to assure proper airflow and ventilation in the building. According to our declaration, they cannot be obstructed. But nevertheless, there are a significant number of unit owners who did renovations in their kitchens or bathrooms, did not get permission before doing it, and they blocked those ventilation area vents. They are now being asked to remove those obstructions. You don't want your client to purchase a property only to be told later on that they have to do substantial work to remove any unauthorized alterations. But then there's another catch here. According to 3407, this section only applies if the executive board has knowledge of the alterations or improvements. Well, I'll tell you that at least in our condominium, neither management nor the board has performed any inspection prior to the sale of any unit. So this clause offers little protection unless you take the initiative to ask the executive board or management to perform an inspection of any unit that your client is thinking of purchasing. You take the initiative and find out about the problem before your client completes the purchase rather than after they've put down money and purchased the property and they're forced to remove any unauthorized alterations. Okay, the next section, item 11, a statement as to whether the executive board has knowledge of any violations of applicable governmental requirements or knowledge of the existence of any hazardous conditions pursuant to section 3402A26 relating to public offering statements with respect to the unit, the limited common elements assigned thereto, or any other portion of the condominium. Again, compliance differs a lot. I know of condominiums where there are hazardous conditions that are caused by asbestos that might be in this structure, but that's not revealed in the 3407 package. I know of a condominium regarding one of my clients where there were layers of fluorine that were placed over a concrete slab. And on the very bottom layer of that fluorine, there is asbestos. But it's not mentioned in the 3407 package because everybody seems to just put a new layer of fluorine over the old layer. And I don't think they're not aware of anybody who's going all the way deep down to the very first layer. Also, what's a hazardous condition? If there's a sidewalk that's in disrepair outside the condominium, is that a hazardous condition that has to be reported? The hazardous conditions that require reporting under 3402A26 refers to contamination affecting the condominium site by hazardous substances or hazardous wastes or the like, or the existence of underground storage tanks for petroleum products or other hazardous substances. And then again, this section only applies if the executive board has notice of the violations of the governmental requirements or hazardous conditions. Now, the makeup of the executive board changes with each election. So does that section mean that all the executive board members have to have knowledge? Only a few? Again, don't just rely on the information you get on the 3407 package about this and ask management questions. Okay, the next item is item 12, which is a statement of the remaining term of any leasehold estate affecting the condominium and the provisions governing any extension or renewal thereof. The most obvious case where this might apply is if a condominium is built on land that's leased from someone else. Then, of course, any prospective owner wants to know about the fact that the condominium owns the building, but not the land on which it's situated, and that there's a lease for the land on which it's situated. But then compliance beyond that differs a lot. What about if our executive board has entered into leases for a portion of our condominium property? So in our case, we've leased some parking spaces to our adjoining neighbor, and we receive rental income in return. Does that need to be reported in the 3407 package? Or a lot of laundry services want to get a lease for the laundry room. That is, we'll hire a company that'll take care of all of our laundry services. They'll put in machines, repair the machines, collect the money, and give us a percentage of how much they make, but they insist on having a lease for the laundry room. Again, I guess things like that should be reported, but compliance differs. All right, the next is a statement as to whether the declaration provides for cumulative voting or class voting. Well, this is important, especially in the election for executive board members. Although our HOA does not permit cumulative votings, there were times we wished that it was in place. There were times when there were so many candidates running for limited board positions that the outcome of the election was uncertain, and we had wished that we could all pool all of our votes for one particular candidate. However, most times cumulative voting, I think, is not permitted. In terms of class voting, I heard of one HOA where the people who owned a property that adjoined the HOA had limited voting rights about what the HOA could do on their property. And they had a separate class of stock. And the actual owners of the HOA had their own share of stock. I've never experienced this. I've only heard about it existing in some condominiums. For the most part, there is no cumulative voting, and there is no class voting in the condominiums that I've had experience with. Okay, the next, the buyer is entitled to a statement as to whether an agreement to terminate the condominium has been submitted to unit owners for approval and remains outstanding. Okay, under the Pennsylvania Uniform Condominium Act, a minimum percentage of votes needed to terminate a condominium is 80%. It can be higher if the declaration specifies a higher amount, but typically 80% of votes is what's needed to terminate a condominium. What's happening in some condominiums is, especially ones in Florida, is a developer comes in and offers to buy the place, and 80% of the unit owners simply sell their place rather than face a large special assessment of several $1,000s. Now, of course, your client, if they're buying into a condominium, they want to know if there's a plan that's afoot to terminate the condominium. However, this section is unclear about how long a petition to terminate lasts. So let's suppose that somebody started a petition to terminate in 2019, but as of 2025, they still don't have the requisite number of signatures. Does that petition still have to be reported because it's still out there? And there's no time limit under the act on how long they have to get those signatures. Just be aware that section is there. And if you learn about any petition to terminate the condominium, you certainly want to look further into it. Next, section 15, a statement of whether the condominium is a master association or is part of a master association or could become a master association or part of a master association. So a master association is a large residential development or community with several subdevelopments. These seem to be more prevalent in places like Florida. They seem to be more prevalent there than in Pennsylvania, although I understand that we may have one or two in our state. The significance of this is that if your HOA is only a subdivision of a master HOA, then your board has limited authority. They're subject to the provisions of a master association board. They have less autonomy. I have not personally run across this in where I am in Montgomery County. The next component of the 3407 package is a statement describing which units, if any, may be owned in timeshare estates and the maximum number of timeshare estates that may be created in the condominium. Well, I guess this is important because you want to know whether your neighbors are only going to be there for a couple of weeks as opposed to whether your neighbors are permanent neighbors who will be there year round. The 3407 package will let you know. The final component of the 3407 package is a statement of whether the declarant retains the special declarant right to cause a merger or consolidation of the condominium. And if so, the information describing such right, which was supplied by the declarant pursuant to Section 320513 relating to the contents of the declaration, all condominiums, if any. Okay. This is particularly important in new construction. This section states that if the declarant or developer retains the right to cause a merger or consolidation of the condominium with another HOA or condominium, they must disclose this fact. So while they're putting together a condominium, a declarant might want to do this in order to pool resources and consolidate the services such as landscaping or maintenance. This will lower the monthly fees. Or the developer might want to do this if they're developing several different communities and community is struggling while the others are doing better. A merger would add financial resiliency. So they might do a merger or consolidation. Again, this is more typical to happen in new condominiums that are still under the control of the declarant. The declarant, once they sell their last unit, the declarant is gone. And now the condominium or HOA is managed by the new board. Okay, one thing I'm also going to mention is Section 3412 of the Uniform Condominium Act. Let's say that you're representing a client buyer who was not advised of the correct amount of the monthly assessment in the 3407 package, then according to the law, they're not responsible for any fees beyond that which was indicated in the 3407 package. Of course, this protection is only going to last until the next budget is passed and the next year's condo fees take effect. But let's say there's a more serious violation. In the earliest part of the presentation, I mentioned that there was an HOA that didn't provide all the purchasers with a complete copy of the declaration, especially the section which provided for a limitation on rental units. Let's say you have a client who purchased thinking they could rent their unit out, and then they found out after they purchased that rentals were prohibited. Well, under this section 3412, they would be entitled to damages, a recovery of any damages, plus attorney fees, plus court costs. So it says if a declarant or any person subject to this subpart, if a declarant or any person subject to this subpart, meaning the Uniform Condominium Act, violates any provision thereof or any provision of the declaration or bylaws, then any person or class of persons adversely affected by a violation has a claim for appropriate relief. Punitive damages may be awarded in the case of a willful violation of the subpart, and if appropriate, the prevailing party may be entitled to an award of costs and reasonable attorney fees. And so the person subject, the person who was damaged could recover their damages. I think I mentioned one HOA where there was an indoor garage. The cost of maintaining those indoor garage spaces was supposed to be allocated to the people who had parking rights, garage parking rights. Well, the garage needed substantial restoration work, and excuse me, and about $800,000 was spent on the restoration work, and yet the board assessed all the unit owners the cost of the renovations, even though the declaration said that only people who had parking rights should be paying for the maintenance of the place. Well, an attorney could bring a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the people who were improperly assessed and recover attorney fees and costs. The whole idea behind this section was that the Attorney General's office did not want to get bogged down with these kinds of issues, and so they deputized each unit owner as an assistant attorney general, and they could hire an attorney to pursue relief. I have read some cases. I read one case recently where there was a dispute over a $7,000 pipe, who had to pay for the repair of the pipe, and the court awarded $50,000 to the unit owner who appealed the the assessment of the cost. Even though only 7,500 was at issue, the unit owner received reimbursement of $50,000 worth of expenses. Now, the reason they did that is because some condo boards seem to feel as a matter of principle, they have to spend money. They have to the attorney for the condominium association represents the corporation. The attorney for the condo association does not represent the unit owners. They represent the condo association, who is managed by the board. So what can occur is, in our case of one of the condominiums I lived in, there was a dispute about a $15,000 expense for new windows, and the board burned up about $100,000 on legal expenses fighting it as a matter of principle. And the board is more apt to do that unless they're responsible for the attorney fees of the other party. And that's why this provision was put in here. Pennsylvania did not enact this provision when they originally adopted the Uniform Condominium Act. They just put this provision in within the last 5 or 10 years. It wasn't okay. So this is an area I just mentioned that condominium owners are such an underrepresented consumer class, and there's a need for reform in the laws. But until that happens, the folks who are going to keep everyone operating professionally, are the private attorneys. All right, so I mentioned the section 3407. In addition to the 3407, prospective purchasers of a condominium should be doing other things too. The most knowledgeable prospective purchasers in our condominium rented a unit and lived in the condominium for a year before they actually bought a unit. This way, they got firsthand knowledge of all the issues. They met their neighbors. In fact, they knew which units were the best ones to buy, and they knew which units were coming up for sale before they were actually placed on the market. If your client can't afford to rent a unit for a year, then see if they can attend the annual meeting. If the last annual meeting was recorded, see if you can get a copy of that recording. Your client should attend one or more events that are held at the condominium so they can meet their neighbors that are going to be managing it with them. If there are condominium or HOA newsletters, your client should get several copies of the past newsletter. If there's a Facebook group or a listserv, ask to get permission to be on that for a while before you purchase. We've had one or two folks who successfully convinced management to let them monitor the listserv for a period of time before they bought. Also, do a visual inspection. Walk around the property and see whether it's run down or whether it's kept up well. The least effective thing to do is to ask other unit owners what they think of the place they live in, because You're not going to get a straight answer. The unit owners, if somebody came up to me and asked about my condominium, whether it's a good place to live, I would look at that person who was asking the question. And if I didn't think they'd make a good neighbor, I would tell them everything horrible about the place in order to discourage them from purchasing. On the other hand, if they were somebody I would love to have as a neighbor, I would tell them it's a great space, irrespective of how much we owe and special assessments coming down the road. I mean, I would tell them it's a great place simply because I want them as a neighbor. So that's the least effective way to find out how good a place is before you go into it. Do the other things that I mentioned, such as look at the newsletter, go to the meetings, etc. And that'll give your client a good idea of what they're getting into for the next 20, 10, 20, 30 years. Uh, okay, so the take home messages, review the 3407 package early on, verify the disclosures, and just educate your clients, and you'll be doing a great service to the community.